You remember a time before the internet, but you're not uncomfortable with it now. You can send a text without overthinking the tone, but you also remember when plans were made on landlines and couldn't be changed. You're fluent in both analog and digital worlds, but you don't fully belong to either. You're not a millennial, though people assume you are. You're not Gen X, though you share their cynicism. You're something in between, a microgeneration that grew up in the gap. And psychologically, that gap shaped everything about how you see yourself, how you connect, and how you move through a world that wasn't built with you in mind. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about how your brain developed in a very specific window of cultural transition, and why that makes you process connection, work, and identity differently than the generations on either side of you. You're not confused. You're adapted to a world that shifted underneath you while you were still forming who you were supposed to be. Let's talk about what that did to your psychology. First, you learned early that stability is temporary. You grew up in a time when the rules were clear, solid, predictable. Then, right as you entered adulthood, everything changed. The economy shifted. Technology exploded. The social contract your parents promised you dissolved. You were told to follow a certain path, and by the time you got there, the path didn't exist anymore. Your brain absorbed a very specific lesson during a critical developmental window. What you're told to rely on will not be there when you need it. That's not pessimism. That's pattern recognition. And it's why you approach promises, institutions, and long-term plans with a kind of cautious distance. You hope, but you don't assume. You commit, but you keep one eye on the exit, not because you're disloyal, but because your formative years taught you that the ground moves. You learn to be ready. Second, you were socialized for a world that no longer exists. You were raised with analog social rules, face-to-face conflict resolution, delayed gratification, waiting for things, calling someone's house and talking to their parents first, building friendships slowly, in person, over time. But you entered adulthood in a world that rewarded speed, visibility, and constant availability. The skills you were taught, patience, privacy, boundaries, became liabilities in a culture that values instant response and public presence. And your brain is caught between two operating systems. You understand the new rules, but they don't feel natural. You can perform them, but they drain you. It's not that you're bad at modern life. It's that you were wired for a version of it that disappeared halfway through your development. You're bilingual in a way most people don't notice, and translation is exhausting. But here's the part nobody tells you. Being between two worlds didn't just create confusion. It gave you a very particular kind of psychological flexibility. You can code switch between generations in a way that feels almost automatic. You can talk to boomers about work ethic and Gen Z about mental health without feeling like a fraud in either conversation. You can appreciate both the value of showing up and the importance of boundaries. You understand loyalty and skepticism at the same time. You're not torn, you're integrated. And that integration came at a cost because you had to learn both languages without a manual, and you did it while everyone around you assumed you spoke only one. Third, your identity formation happened in private. You didn't grow up with social media. Your teenage years, your early mistakes, your cringy phases, they weren't documented. They didn't live forever in a cloud. You got to try on identities, fail, reinvent yourself, and leave no trace. That gave your brain something crucial: permission to be inconsistent. You weren't performing development, you were just developing. And because of that, you have a relationship with your past self that's less curated, less defensive. You're not trying to maintain a narrative that started when you were 15. You can look back and cringe without it being tied to your current identity, because there's no digital thread connecting them. But that also means you entered adulthood without the infrastructure for visibility that younger generations have. You don't instinctively share your process. You don't default to community when you're struggling. You were taught to figure it out privately first. And that makes you resilient, but it also makes you isolated in ways you don't always name. Fourth, you have a complicated relationship with ambition. You were raised with the Gen X message that trying too hard is embarrassing, that caring too much makes you a target, that coolness is detachment. But you also absorbed the millennial pressure to optimize, to hustle, to build a personal brand. And your brain is stuck between those two scripts. You want to succeed, but you don't want to look like you're trying. You care deeply, but you've learned to perform indifference. It's not imposter syndrome, it's a generational mixed message that got internalized as self-protection. You were told that wanting things makes you vulnerable, and also that not wanting enough makes you lazy. So you learn to want things quietly, to work hard without talking about it, to achieve without celebrating. And that creates a strange psychological tension because you're constantly managing the optics of effort, even when no one's watching. And this is where it gets interesting. The behavior that protected you early on, skepticism, self-reliance, emotional restraint, starts to feel different as you age. What felt like strength in your 20s starts to feel like distance in your 40s. The ability to adapt, to not need too much, to keep moving, it served you when the world was unstable. But now, in moments where you actually want stability, where you want to be seen, where you want to stop translating, you realize you don't know how to stop being flexible. You don't know how to ask for something without an escape plan. You don't know how to be still without feeling like you're falling behind. The same psychological tools that helped you survive transition are now the things that make it hard to land. Fifth, you experience nostalgia differently than other generations. For you, nostalgia isn't just about missing the past. It's about missing a version of the world that made sense. A world where you knew the rules, where things moved slower, where you had time to think before responding. And because you lived in both worlds, you can feel the loss more acutely. You know exactly what was traded for convenience, for speed, for access. You remember what it felt like to be bored, to wait, to not know something immediately, and while you've adapted, there's a part of your brain that grieves the textures of that older world. Not because it was better, but because it was the world you were built for. And now you're living in a different one and doing it well, but the fit is just slightly off. Sixth, you regulate emotion through competence. Because you grew up in a time when feelings weren't centered the way they are now, you learn to manage distress by being useful, by solving problems, by staying busy. Your nervous system doesn't calm down through talking or processing the way younger generations were taught to. It calms down through doing, through mastering something, through proving you can handle it. And that's not wrong, but it means you sometimes confuse productivity with emotional regulation. You think you're fine because you're functional. You think you've processed something because you've moved past it, but your body holds tension you never named, and your brain keeps score in ways you don't always notice until something small breaks you open. And here's what most people miss. You're not stuck between two generations because you didn't pick a side. You're between them because you contain both. You carry the self-reliance of Gen X and the awareness of millennials. You have the work ethic of boomers and the skepticism of Gen Z. You're not half-formed, you're doubled. And that doubling makes you extraordinarily perceptive, deeply adaptable, and quietly exhausted because you're always translating, always aware of multiple perspectives, always holding space for contradictions that other people don't even notice. You don't need to resolve that tension. You don't need to pick a lane. You don't need to be more of one thing and less of another. You just need to recognize that being in the gap gave you a kind of psychological range most people don't have. And that range is valuable, even when it's tiring. You were raised in one world and came of age in another, and your brain learned to live in both. That's not confusion. That's intelligence. That's survival. That's you.